morning, everyone. This is Nathaniel. We are going to talk about Latin America, Miss Avelino, Mr. Sunega, and Mr. Or. What is Latin America? Give us some and Miss Sandoval.
Most locals in this nation speak Spanish and Portuguese.
Good morning, everyone. This is Nathan, your speaker for today, and welcome to our live talk show, the cocoNAT Talks. As what we've mentioned to our previous video, we are going to talk about Latin America. And I've gathered some speakers for today, and I want to call them Mr. Tancinco, Mr. Almaria, Mr. Bitancor, Mr. Sanchez, Miss Sandoval, Miss Avelino, Mr. Sunega, and Mr. Oro, who's going to give us some information about the topic. So I want to start off by knowing what is Latin America. And Miss Sandoval?
Thank you, Nat. What is Latin America? Latin America consists of Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central and South America. Most locals in this nation speak Spanish and Portuguese. These two tongues fall under the Romance language category, descended from Latin. Thus Latin America is named. It might be challenging to define the region of Latin America. It is sometimes considered a geographical area that encompasses the entire Caribbean, all nations in the Western Hemisphere, south of the United States, regardless of language. Others define it as a geographic area where the Romance language, Spanish, Portuguese, or French predominate, or as the nations that have experienced past Iberian, Spanish, and Portuguese colonialism. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you for that wonderful information, Miss Sandoval. And I want to know about some brief history of Latin, who's going to talk about by Mr. Oro.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Torralba. It started with several indigenous groups, including the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas. So these groups had lived in Latin America for millennia before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. And these groups all possess highly advanced civilizations. The first Europeans to reach the Americas were the Spanish, who were soon followed by Portuguese, who settled in Brazil. So Spanish explorers and conquerors arrived in the Caribbean before moving to Central America, Mexico, and South America. Then Brazil became independent from Portugal in 1825, while most of Latin America did so between 1810 and 1825. Cuba, one of the two remaining Spanish colonies, attained independence in 1898. The same year, Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States as part of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish American War. That's all.
Wow, thank you for that information, Mr. Oro. So, I want to talk about the contemporary foreign and economic policies of each country, which will be discussed by Mr. Tancinco.
All right. Foreign policy toward Latin America is initially focused on excluding or limiting the military economic influence of European powers, territorial expansion, and encouraging American commerce. The socio-economic patterns of what is now Latin America were set in the colonial era when the region was controlled by Spanish and Portuguese empires. The America economy is an export-based economy consisting of individual countries in the geographical regions of the North America, Central America, and the South America and the Caribbean. In the 19th century, following interdependence, many economies of the Latin America declined in the 19th century. Much of the Latin America was integrated in the economy of exporter of commodities. That's all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tancinco. And I want to know about the similarities and difference between the Latin America from the developing nations. And I think this will be talked about by Mr. Sanchez and Mr. Sanyega.
Thank you, Mr. Torralba. So, the differences between the developing nation and the global south are the following. The third world is also known as a developing nation. Basically, basically today, the preferred terminology for the third world is developing nations, while the global south is used as an alternative for third world during the Cold War to distinguish or recognize the developing nations, while the similarities between the developing nation and the global south are the following. Both developing nation and the global south are in a poor state to grow their country or nation, and they are both in rapidly growing population. And for more info, let's hear my friend JP Sanchez.
The vast majority of these nations are situated in our nearby tropical regions, a country where the average income is significantly less than in industrialized countries, where a small number of exports drive the economy crops, and where archaic ways handle farming. In a country where the average income is significantly lower than in industrialized countries whose economies are dependent on a few export crops, and where agriculture is practiced using traditional techniques in numerous rapid population. The, in- the increase affects the supply in developing countries, the food. Developing countries are also referred to as undeveloped nations. They are primarily found in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. That's all, Mr. Torralba.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sanchez and Mr. Sonyegas. So, since we talk about the difference and similarities between the Latin America from the developing nations, I want to know about the commonalities and difference between the regionalization and globalization, which will be talked about by Miss Avelino.
Thank you for that, Mr. Torralba. The commonalities and differences between regionalization and globalization are dual processes. The key points will define these processes are coherence, interdependence, and contradiction, and it depends on the patterns interaction between the players. Processes, whether competitive or cooperative, win out. The modern economic globalization, different institutional and socioeconomic development outcomes are influenced by space. Economic actors operating at various levels determine the variety of economic processes that violate economic space and order. Globalization and regionalization processes institutional component is reflected in developing new game rules in the economic sphere that concern all business organizations. The games regulations which are based on the country's export of formal and informal institutions. Certain hegemony and a break and do are the strong social and economic ties between these nations that advance the resolution of the world's economic problems by enhancing technical nationalism, rising poverty, and the strained global economic risks. New game rules must be based on very distinct states, interaction between nations, partnership business, including transnational worldwide economic groups, cooperate and work closely together. There arose a new kind of mega competition in the modern era, an institutional antagonism that represents a system of conflict. That's all. Thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you for that information, Miss Avelino. And lastly, how did the experience of Latin America countries contribute to the new conception of global relations? And I want to call on Mr. Almaria to talk about this one.
Thank you for that, Mr. Torralba. Um, it contributed by showing that once colonized, countries can still rise on their own without the need to depend on other nations or countries, and that being unique is not all bad. We have our own cultures, whether influenced or taken after other cultures, it's still cultures, yours or ours. And we do not need to be ashamed of it because we all have different or the same views on things in life. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that information, Mr. Almaria. And to wrap this up, we have Mr. Bitancor to give us a summary of what Latin America is. So, Mr. Bitancor?
Latin America is a diverse region that resides on the western hemisphere of South of the United States, a region that consists of Mexico, the Caribbean, Central and South America. There exist many tongues and languages that falls under the Romance language category in Latin America, descended from Latin, which contributed to naming the region Latin America. The foreign and economic policy of the region is very unique compared to the rest of the world, as it focuses on lessening the influence of other countries or continents like Europe. Latin America is also an export-based economy, as it's known to be one of the most active trading regions in the world back in 17th century. Latin America is defined by many things. A region that includes the entire Caribbean and all Western Hemisphere countries south of the United States, or it could be defined as the state of America during 18th to 19th century as it was ruled by the Spanish, the Portuguese, and French. Or it could refer to the time when America was a free and wild state, captivated by no empire or nation. Many definitions, meanings, and origins, all significant in their own ways. But one thing really matters. Latin America is unique and diverse as it can get. Thank you.
Thank you for that quick summary of what Latin America is, Mr. Bitancor. And before we end the show, I would like to thank you guys for joining me here. And I hope everyone who's watching this has a brief understanding about Latin America. And thank you so much for tuning in. And again, this is Nathan, your speaker for today at cocoNAT Talks. And goodbye.